Across golden thrones and crumbling empires, history's most powerful rulers carried secrets their crowns could not conceal. Behind royal portraits of grace and grandeur hid trembling hands, forbidden vices, and midnight rituals of escape. From the opium dens of emperors to the gambling halls of kings, these addictions shaped destinies and sometimes destroyed them. Tonight, we lift the velvet curtain on 30 royals with secret addictions, a journey through palaces where temptation ruled as fiercely as power itself. Glass raised, curtain up. The truth behind the throne begins now. If stories of hidden power and royal secrets pull you in, don't slip away into the shadows just yet. Hit subscribe and join our growing court of curious minds. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your kingdom right now. Are you wandering through history with us at midnight or catching this tale with morning tea? Either way, welcome to the descent behind the crown. 1. Jahangir, Mughal Emperor, India. Born into the splendor of the Mughal court, Prince Salim, later Emperor Jahangir, was destined to inherit an empire that glittered with jewels, power, and expectation. But behind the marble palaces and fragrant gardens lay a private struggle that few outside his inner circle fully understood. Jahangir was a man torn between his towering intellect and his human frailty. His name, meaning world Caesar, spoke of ambition, yet his body bore the marks of dependency. His own memoir, Tuzuki Jahangiri, offers flashes of candor rare for a monarch, confessions of indulgence, attempts at reform, and relapses into weakness. Jahangir's story begins not as a cautionary tale, but as a portrait of the intoxicating world of the Mughal elite. At court, wine flowed as freely as poetry, and the line between luxury and vice was paper-thin. The emperor was known to delight in debate, painting, and natural science, but his true nemesis was the goblet. Even during his father Akbar's lifetime, young Salim's taste for drink alarmed courtiers. When he ascended the peacock throne in 1605, his dependency had already deepened into ritual. Yet Jahangir never cloaked his weakness in moral excuses. He recorded it with surprising honesty, writing that he once consumed 20 cups of wine daily, each one numbing his imperial precision a little more. But the story didn't end there. Seeking control, Jahangir attempted a self-imposed reform, a gradual reduction of his drinking, each day 1 cup less. When he succeeded, he replaced wine with another temptation: opium. Opium at the Mughal court was seen less as an illicit drug and more as a refined medicine or indulgence taken in the name of composure. Yet over time, it dulled the emperor's clarity, clouding decisions and deepening dependence. Chroniclers noted how his speech slowed, his judgment wavered, and his reliance on trusted consorts, especially the formidable Empress Nur Jahan, grew ever greater. Nur Jahan herself became part of the concealment. Her administrative brilliance shielded the empire from collapse while quietly managing her husband's fragility. Diplomats who visited the court reported a ruler whose charisma remained intact, even as his health visibly declined. They saw jeweled goblets on the table, but were never allowed to see the trembling hands that held them. Painters of the Mughal atelier immortalized Jahangir as serene, haloed, and divine, never weary, never weak. The empire's public narrative demanded an image of celestial perfection, and so his indulgence became a palace secret maintained through silence, loyalty, and fear. Yet beneath the marble calm, the emperor's own words betrayed self-awareness. He described intoxication not only as pleasure, but as punishment, an invisible chain binding his royal will. He spoke of the pain of withdrawal, of the illusion of control, of the brief lucidity that came with each vow of abstinence. These reflections, preserved through the centuries, turned Jahangir from mere monarch to tragic human, a ruler who conquered half the subcontinent, yet struggled to govern himself. In a sense, Jahangir's addiction mirrors the empire he ruled. Magnificent but vulnerable, powerful yet precariously balanced between indulgence and order. His courtiers could hide his shaking hands, his biographers could omit his vices, but his own pen refused to lie. That rare honesty gives historians a window into the private cost of public divinity, a reminder that the gilded world of emperors often concealed a personal prison. As the emperor's strength waned, Nur Jahan's shadow grew longer. Together they maintained the illusion of stability until his death in 1627, when the empire's glory dimmed with him. Yet the precedent was set. Future Mughal rulers inherited not just a throne, but a legacy of masking human weakness behind imperial perfection. And far to the west, another monarch would soon take that same hypocrisy to even darker extremes. A sultan who forbade drink for his subjects while drowning privately in it. 2. Murad IV, Ottoman Sultan, reigned 1623 to 1640. When Murad IV ascended the Ottoman throne at the age of 11, the empire was a cauldron of rebellion, corruption, and decline. He inherited not only an empire trembling on the edge of chaos, but also a palace thick with intrigue. As he matured, Murad projected an image of iron control. His name became synonymous with discipline and fear. He outlawed coffee, tobacco, and alcohol, commanding moral reform with the ferocity of divine mandate. But behind the gilded curtains of the Topkapi Palace, the Sultan himself was slipping deeper into the very vice he had sworn to destroy. The hypocrisy was deliberate, not accidental. Murad's public decrees banning intoxicants served a political purpose. They reinforced his image as the restorer of moral order after years of decadence. To the people of Istanbul, the coffee houses he shut down were breeding grounds for sedition, the taverns nests of treason. He would ride incognito through the city at night, executing anyone found drinking or smoking. The terror of his patrols became legendary. Yet those same nights often ended with the Sultan raising a jeweled cup in private, drowning the weight of his empire in forbidden wine. Contemporary accounts from Ottoman chroniclers hint at the secret life of the ruler. While his officials parroted the image of a puritanical reformer, the palace staff knew the truth. Murad drank heavily in the privacy of his chambers, and his temper, already volatile, was sharpened by intoxication. His bouts of rage became unpredictable. Courtiers learned to read his moods with the caution of sailors studying storm clouds. Physicians were forbidden to speak of his health, and those who dared to whisper about the contradiction between decree and practice risked their heads. What drove Murad to such self-destruction? Historians suggest that his rule was shaped by trauma. He came of age during the Ottoman court's most violent years. His brothers murdered, his mother's influence dominant, and his empire riddled with mutiny. The young sultan's iron laws were born from fear, not virtue. He saw indulgence as the root of imperial decay, and in trying to purge it from others, he attempted to master it within himself. But the very act of suppression only deepened the craving. The forbidden goblet became both his escape and his punishment. Murad's addiction was not widely known beyond the palace walls. The chroniclers who adored him painted him as a paragon of sobriety, a warrior king who restored the army's discipline. Only later historians, examining medical and personal records, began to uncover the double life he led. The irony was cruel. The man who executed his subjects for drinking could not face a night without it himself. In his final years, the price of secrecy began to show. His health deteriorated rapidly. Liver disease, likely worsened by drink, left him weakened. Yet even on his deathbed, the legend was maintained. Official court bulletins described a monarch felled by divine will, not human weakness. The empire mourned its restorer of order, never suspecting that the great enforcer of temperance had himself been consumed by forbidden indulgence. Murad IV's story stands as one of history's most striking paradoxes, a ruler whose tyranny over pleasure masked a private surrender to it. His life embodied the conflict between image and reality, piety and craving, will and weakness. Beneath the roar of empire and the fear of his subjects was a lonely man fighting shadows of his own making. And while the Ottoman palace sealed its secrets behind marble walls, another sultan, Murad's own ancestor, had already left a legacy of intoxication so infamous that even the passage of centuries could not erase his nickname, the Drunkard. If you're still here, wandering through the shadows of royal secrets, you're exactly the kind of mind this kingdom was built for. Don't just watch, join us. Hit subscribe, step into the royal court of curiosity, and tell me below where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. Are you exploring history's vices under the glow of midnight, or uncovering them with your morning coffee? Either way, the next descent is already waiting. 3. Selim II, the Drunkard, Ottoman Sultan, year 1566 to 1574. In the long and often austere line of Ottoman rulers, Selim II stands apart as the emperor who inherited an empire at its zenith and quietly lost himself within its pleasures. The son of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and the brilliant Hurrem Sultan, Selim was born into grandeur, diplomacy, and poetry. Yet history would remember him by a single cruel epithet: Sarhosh Selim, Selim the Drunkard. Behind that mocking title, however, lies a story far more complex, a tale of a ruler whose personal weaknesses were carefully masked by one of the most efficient administrations in the early modern world. Selim's addiction to wine did not erupt overnight. Ottoman chroniclers trace his indulgence back to his youth, when he served as governor of Kütahya. The province was known for its vineyards, and the young prince developed a taste for the region's strong red wine. Though Islam forbade intoxicants, the boundaries of royal privilege often blurred doctrine with indulgence. By the time Selim ascended the throne in 1566, his fondness for drink was well known among the inner court, but carefully veiled from public discourse. In an empire that saw the caliph as the spiritual defender of Islam, such a revelation could have been catastrophic. The concealment of Selim's vice was no accident. His Grand Vizier, the formidable Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, orchestrated a delicate balance, governing with precision while allowing the Sultan to retreat into his private world. Sokolu handled diplomacy, warfare, and administration, ensuring that the empire continued to function flawlessly, even as the Sultan spent more time in the palace gardens than in council chambers. It was a partnership of convenience. The empire got stability, the Sultan got freedom from scrutiny. Contemporary European diplomats, whose reports often mixed fascination with judgment, described the Ottoman court as an elaborate stage play. The vizier played the public role of ruler, while the real sultan enjoyed the theatre of leisure. Wine was served discreetly in crystal flasks, its colour masked with fruit syrups, and palace musicians softened the sounds of laughter that might otherwise carry through the marble halls. It was said that Selim could spend days secluded in pleasure pavilions, where poetry, music, and drink blurred into a continuous haze of contentment. Yet despite his reputation, Selim II was neither foolish nor entirely passive. He approved ambitious naval campaigns, including the conquest of Cyprus in 1571, a victory that would provoke the Battle of Lepanto, one of the most consequential naval clashes in Mediterranean history. Ironically, while Christian Europe celebrated its victory at Lepanto as divine proof of Ottoman weakness, Selim's empire soon recovered, rebuilding its fleet within months. His addiction may have dulled his vigor, but it did not extinguish the vast machinery of the Ottoman state. Still, the toll of excess grew heavier with each year. Chroniclers speak of frequent illnesses, sluggishness, and the emperor's growing dependence on pleasure as a refuge from the impossible standards set by his father's reign. When he died suddenly in 1574, reportedly after a fall in his bathhouse, official bulletins attributed his death to divine fate, not decadence. But within the palace, whispers persisted that the Sultan's health had been long eroded by wine. History has treated Selim harshly, branding him with a title that reduced a multifaceted ruler to a single vice. Yet beneath the mockery lies a poignant truth. Selim was a man born into perfection, forever haunted by it. His empire demanded a conqueror. He offered instead a patron of art, poetry, and indulgence. The court preserved his dignity in marble and calligraphy, while silencing the cup that trembled in his hand. And as the sun set over the Bosporus, the world would soon see another monarch far to the east, a ruler who also balanced empire and intoxication, not with wine, but with the smoke of another forbidden comfort: opium. 4. Nasr al-Din Shah Qajar, Qajar, Iran, from 1848 to 1896. When Nasr al-Din Shah ascended the peacock throne of Persia in 1848, he was barely 17, a curious, intelligent youth surrounded by courtiers twice his age and ambition. His reign would stretch for nearly half a century, a span long enough to witness the first photographs in Iran, the arrival of the telegraph, and the slow, tightening grip of European imperial influence. Yet for all the trappings of modernity that marked his rule, the Shah himself remained tethered to older comforts, chief among them the ritual pleasures of tobacco and opium. In Qajar, Iran, the line between habit and addiction was a quiet one. Tobacco was a social necessity. To smoke in company was to demonstrate refinement. To offer a pipe was to extend friendship. Opium, meanwhile, occupied a stranger space, neither wholly condemned nor entirely accepted. Persian physicians prescribed it in moderation for sleeplessness, anxiety, and chronic pain. In the Shah's palace, it was both medicine and ceremony. Nasr al-Din Shah was known to enjoy small doses of opium dissolved in syrup, a habit that over time grew from routine relaxation into dependency. For most of his reign, this addiction remained hidden in plain sight. The royal physicians kept meticulous logs of the Shah's health, though the euphemisms they used, restorative draughts, soothing tonics, barely disguised the reality. Those closest to the monarch knew of his reliance, but protected his dignity fiercely. To the wider world, the Shah presented the image of a cosmopolitan reformer. He toured Europe, posed for photographs with monarchs, and adopted Western technologies with enthusiasm. In every official portrait he appeared immaculate: jeweled sword, polished boots, the serene gaze of an enlightened autocrat. No trace of fatigue, no tremor of dependence, but cracks occasionally showed through. European diplomats who visited the Persian court described long delays before audiences as the Shah prepared himself in private. Others noted a curious lethargy in his later years, punctuated by bursts of restless energy. His close advisors learned to schedule critical discussions in the mornings, before the day's indulgences dulled his attention. Though he ruled with absolute power, the machinery of governance increasingly depended on those who could interpret his moods and navigate his absences. The most ironic episode of Nasr al-Din Shah's reign, the tobacco concession of 1890, brought his private vice into public conflict. When he granted a British company a monopoly on the Persian tobacco trade, protests erupted across the country. Clerics, merchants, and even members of his own household joined a boycott. In one famous act of defiance, the Shah's wives reportedly broke their pipes in protest. Though the rebellion was about sovereignty and economics, the symbolism cut deeper, a nation resisting not only foreign domination, but the indulgence of its own ruler. The Shah eventually revoked the concession, humiliated but still unwilling to confront his own dependence on the very product that had sparked the uprising. By the time of his assassination in 1896, Nasr al-Din Shah had become a paradox, both modernizer and traditionalist, visionary and escapist. His diaries reveal flashes of melancholy beneath the formality, hints of self-awareness that his pleasures had become chains. Even in death, his image was preserved with care. The court photographers captured him in regal stillness, the nation's first modern monarch immortalized as an icon of poise. No trace of the fatigue, the half-hidden smoke, or the quiet rituals that had shaped his days. His legacy, like his life, remained perfumed with contradiction. A ruler who built telegraph lines while clinging to the pipe, who ushered Persia toward the modern age even as he soothed himself with ancient narcotics. And across the continent, in another fading empire to the east, a young empress would inherit that same habit, not as luxury, but as slow undoing. 5. Empress Wanrong, Empress Consort of Manchukuo, Digun 1946. The story of Empress Wanrong is one of beauty, tragedy, and imperial illusion, an opulent cage built from politics and dependence. Born into a distinguished Manchu family in 1906, she came of age in a China struggling to define itself after centuries of imperial rule. Educated in both Chinese and Western etiquette, fluent in English, and celebrated for her poise, Wanrong seemed destined to embody the modern woman of a new age. Yet history trapped her in the ghostly remnants of a collapsing dynasty. As the last empress of China, married to Puyi, the deposed Qing emperor, her life would gradually dissolve into isolation and addiction, concealed behind the facade of courtly grace. When Wanrong married Puyi in 1922, the ceremony revived the rituals of imperial splendor one last time. Though the dynasty had already fallen a decade earlier, the wedding inside the Forbidden City shimmered with nostalgic magnificence, crimson silks, ancient music, and the illusion that the old world still breathed. But within those same palace walls, life was lonely and airless. Puyi, more a museum exhibit than a monarch, was detached and distant, while the once glorious court now served as little more than a stage set maintained by foreign powers and aging attendants. The first seeds of Wanrong's dependency were sown in this confinement. Servants whispered that she began smoking tobacco to ease her anxiety, a habit imported from the fashionable circles of 1920s Beijing, where cigarettes symbolized sophistication. Over time, that habit deepened, transforming into the darker indulgence of opium, which circulated freely among high society in the Republican era. Initially, it was a social ritual, graceful, refined, and hidden behind perfumed curtains. But as the years passed and her isolation deepened, opium became not merely a pastime, but a refuge from the emotional barrenness of her marriage and the disorienting collapse of her identity. When Japan established the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932, Puyi was installed as emperor under Tokyo's supervision, and Wanrong followed as empress consort. Official propaganda presented her as the serene symbol of continuity, a regal figure in embroidered robes, attending ceremonies with delicate composure. Behind the photographs, however, her life had become a slow unraveling. The Japanese handlers kept her under constant surveillance, her movements tightly controlled. Opium, once a private solace, became her silent rebellion, a way to reclaim a fragment of agency in a world that had turned her into an ornament. Visitors to the Manchukuo court in Changchun described her as ethereal and hauntingly detached. Her attendance ensured that foreign diplomats never saw the empress at her weakest. The palace staff cleaned and perfumed her rooms daily, concealing the signs of deterioration. To the outside world, she remained the Jade Empress, a symbol of refinement, untouched by turmoil. But those closest to her watched as addiction hollowed the brilliance that had once captivated Beijing society. As World War II reached its violent close and Japan's empire crumbled, so too did the illusion of Manchukuo. Puyi fled as Soviet forces advanced, leaving Wanrong behind in Manchuria, a prisoner of circumstance and her own failing health. The final months of her life remain shrouded in silence. Records suggest she was captured and later died in harsh captivity in 1946, deprived of medicine, comfort, or even recognition. The empire that had once cloaked her in silk and ceremony left her to fade into obscurity, her story scattered through fragments of memoirs and declassified archives. Wanrong's tragedy lies not only in her addiction, but in what it symbolized: the decay of imperial identity itself. She embodied a dying world, refined, ceremonial, and fragile, trying to survive in a century that no longer needed emperors or empresses. Her dependence was the hidden shadow of a dynasty's ghost, a final indulgence in a life built on illusion. And as her story closed in quiet despair, the same substance that comforted her would resurface within the walls of Manchukuo's palace itself, surrounding the man who had once been her husband, the last emperor of China, who would find himself trapped by history and haunted by smoke. 6. Puyi, last emperor of China, emperor of Manchukuo, Yi, 1908 to 1912, 1934 to 1945. Few figures in world history embody the dislocation between power and helplessness as vividly as Aisinjioro Puyi, the boy who became emperor at 3, abdicated at 6, and spent the rest of his life searching for meaning in a world that no longer had a throne for him. His addictions, both literal and metaphorical, were the residue of this search. Though history often reduces him to a tragic symbol of a fallen dynasty, the truth behind his life is more human and painful, a portrait of dependency, secrecy, and survival in the twilight of imperial China. Puyi's early years inside the Forbidden City were defined by isolation. Surrounded by eunuchs, courtiers, and tutors who addressed him as the Son of Heaven, he had everything except genuine freedom. The emperor's daily life followed rigid rituals where even his laughter was scheduled. In such an environment, the boy grew curious and restless, craving any form of escape. After his abdication in 1912, the Qing court lingered within the palace under the Republic's tolerance, allowing him to remain as a guest emperor. Yet what began as ceremonial confinement slowly eroded his sense of self. Cut off from the modernizing world outside, Puyi clung to the pomp of an empire that no longer existed. By his teenage years, Puyi had developed habits of indulgence, luxury, vanity, and dependence on the servants who maintained his illusion of authority. Alcohol, tobacco, and opium were part of court life, though Puyi himself initially viewed them with disdain. But as he grew older, the atmosphere of stagnation that enveloped the palace began to change him. The Forbidden City became a gilded prison filled with idle courtiers' gossip and endless smoke curling from the pipes of attendants. Opium was not only tolerated, it was a social lubricant, a shared dream within the crumbling empire's final chambers. When the Japanese seized Manchuria and offered Puyi a puppet throne in 1932, he seized it as a chance to restore his imperial dignity. Installed as the ruler of Manchukuo, he lived in a palace meticulously designed to project grandeur, but controlled entirely by Japanese advisors. Every speech, every decree, every movement was scripted for him. It was during these years that addiction took deeper root, not necessarily as heavy personal consumption, but as an environmental constant. Opium and morphine circulated freely in his household, and many of his attendants, guards, and even family members, including Empress Wanrong, were dependent on them. Puyi's own reliance leaned more towards sedatives and stimulants prescribed to calm his anxiety and sleeplessness, which only worsened under occupation. The facade of divine authority was upheld at any cost. Photographers captured Puyi in perfect attire, standing beside Japanese officials, the emblem of a reborn monarchy. Yet beneath the layers of uniform and ceremony was a man who could not make a single decision without permission. Addiction in this world was not just chemical, it was psychological, an enslavement to illusion. The emperor who once commanded millions could not even choose when to sleep or eat without consent. His palace was perfumed, silent, and suffocating, a stage on which he acted out a role written by others. When Japan's empire collapsed in 1945, Puyi's fragile illusion shattered. Captured by Soviet forces, he was stripped of privilege, luxury, and narcotics alike. During his imprisonment and eventual re-education under Communist China, he experienced withdrawal not only from substances, but from the identity that had defined him. His later memoirs, written under state supervision, paint a man who came to view his past indulgences as symbols of weakness, not pleasure. He admitted that the palace walls had kept him childish and dependent, and that opium and luxury had dulled his will long before the empire fell. By the time of his death in 1967, Puyi had become almost unrecognizable, a quiet gardener in Beijing, tending plants rather than courtiers, living modestly in a state-owned apartment. Yet the ghosts of his past lingered, the haze of smoke, the loneliness of control, and the memory of an empire numbed by denial. His story closes as both tragedy and parable. That addiction, whether to opium or power, can enslave even those born to rule. And far across the Pacific, another monarch, born under the bright skies of the Hawaiian Islands, would soon face his own downfall, not through narcotics or sedatives, but through a different form of intoxicant altogether: the rush of gambling, politics, and royal excess. 7. King Kalakaua, King of Hawaii, reigned through 1874 to 1891. King David Kalakaua, remembered by his people as Ki Ali Makainana, the people's king, was a monarch of charisma, vision, and contradictions. He reigned over a Polynesian kingdom at the crossroads of modernity and colonial ambition, a world where sugar planters and foreign diplomats were slowly rewriting the destiny of the Hawaiian Islands. Kalakaua's addiction was not to any one substance, but to the glittering allure of excess itself, lavish feasts, gambling, and indulgent living that both inspired and endangered his reign. Beneath the lees and laughter, the royal court concealed a growing reputation for extravagance, one that would later be weaponized by his political enemies to erode the very monarchy he loved. Born in 1836, Kalakaua was a child of the Hawaiian Renaissance, a generation that sought to preserve native culture while embracing the technologies and manners of the Western world. He was a composer, dancer, and patron of the arts, earning him the nickname the Merry Monarch. Yet even as he revived hula and restored traditional ceremonies once suppressed by missionaries, he cultivated an equally intense fascination with the pageantry of European royalty. When he traveled abroad, the first reigning monarch ever to circumnavigate the globe, he returned with tales of grand palaces, operas, and glittering banquets that he wished to recreate in Honolulu. In the 1880s, the royal palace he commissioned, Iolani, became the most modern residence in the Pacific, adorned with electric lights, crystal chandeliers, and imported furniture. But maintaining such splendor drained the royal treasury, and Kalakaua's appetite for spectacle grew as his kingdom's finances thinned. He wagered heavily at cards and billiards, often hosting games that lasted through the night. To his supporters, this was harmless sociability, a king living with joyful flair. To his critics, especially foreign businessmen eager to weaken the monarchy, it was evidence of moral decline and fiscal irresponsibility. Then came the opium license scandal of 1886, the episode that nearly destroyed his reputation. The controversy began when it was revealed that the right to distribute opium in the islands, a lucrative trade in that era, had been sold through bribery and backdoor dealings. Although the evidence of Kalakaua's direct involvement was never conclusive, his political opponents seized upon it as proof of royal corruption. In the press, whispers of the king's pleasures, his late-night revelry, his rumored fondness for drink, his gambling debts were magnified until they became a portrait of decadence. Behind the palace walls, however, the truth was more nuanced. Kalakaua's indulgence stemmed from exhaustion and melancholy as much as from vanity. He had watched his nation shrink under external pressure, its independence eroding with each new treaty and land concession. Gambling and festivity became his means of escape, a desperate assertion of sovereignty in a world where joy itself was slipping away. Courtiers worked diligently to preserve his public image, debts quietly paid, newspapers silenced, and scandals buried. Yet each cover-up only fueled rumors further, until the myth of the merry monarch blurred with that of the fallen king. By the time Kalakaua died in San Francisco in 1891, his health weakened and his monarchy under siege. The story of his reign had hardened into legend. To some, he was the joyous ruler who brought music and pride back to his people. To others, he was the reckless dreamer who gambled away the stability of a kingdom. In truth, he was both a man of deep love for his culture and deep sorrow for its loss, a monarch who sought to celebrate life even as his empire's days grew numbered. And as his empire faded into memory, another royal world, far older and more gilded, was falling to the same intoxicating trap, the Egyptian court of King Farouk, where pleasure, secrecy, and scandal would once again dance together beneath the veil of royal dignity. 8. Farouk I, King of Egypt, rendered 1936 to 1952. King Farouk I of Egypt lived as if history itself were his private stage, a young monarch with immense charm, unlimited wealth, and an unending appetite for pleasure. He ascended the throne at just 16, inheriting one of the most symbolically powerful monarchies in the Islamic world. For a brief time, he was celebrated as a symbol of hope, a bridge between Egypt's ancient grandeur and modern independence. But as the years passed, the royal image began to crack, revealing a man whose addictions, food, gambling, and acquisitive obsession became both personal escape and public scandal. Farouk's early years shaped the contradictions that defined his reign. Educated in England, he returned to Cairo fluent in Western manners but deeply conscious of his royal lineage. He cultivated an aura of elegance, finely tailored suits, fast cars, and evenings spent in the glittering cafes of Alexandria and Cairo. Yet beneath this sophistication lay insecurity. Surrounded by foreign advisors and watchful courtiers, Farouk struggled to command genuine authority in a country increasingly restless under British influence. The pleasures he indulged were not just luxuries, they were distractions from the pressures of sovereignty. Food was his first and most visible comfort. Reports from palace staff described tables heavy with sweets, meats, and imported delicacies. Farouk's voracious appetite became the subject of whispered fascination, feeding into his expanding waistline and feeding, too, the caricature of a king out of touch with his people's hardships. But it was his passion for gambling and collecting that revealed a deeper obsession. Farouk was a compulsive buyer, amassing rare coins, stamps, jewels, and even entire automobile fleets. His desire to possess beauty in all forms bordered on mania. He reportedly carried priceless objects in his pockets, as though the tactile presence of luxury could reassure him of his worth. Among his most peculiar compulsions was kleptomania, a royal quirk turned open secret. On state visits, Farouk was known to slip souvenirs, cutlery, or even pocket watches into his coat when he thought no one was watching. The incidents were often smoothed over diplomatically, dismissed as eccentricities of a young monarch. Courtiers worked tirelessly to protect his dignity, quietly returning missing items and deflecting gossip. The Egyptian press, tightly controlled by palace censors, rarely mentioned the behavior, but foreign diplomats and journalists recorded it in private reports, noting that the king's need to take reflected something psychological rather than criminal, an addiction to possession in a world where everything was already his. By the 1940s, the contradictions of Farouk's rule had become unsustainable. He lived in palatial splendor while his people faced poverty and political unrest. His gambling debts grew, his nights lengthened, and his grip on reality loosened. Rumors of late-night escapades and casino losses spread through Cairo like perfume in the heat, never confirmed, but impossible to suppress. His image, once carefully polished by loyal ministers, now symbolized extravagance at a time when Egypt's nationalist fervor demanded restraint. When the free officers, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, staged a coup in 1952, the king's fall was swift and nearly bloodless. Exiled to Italy, Farouk carried with him only a fraction of his wealth and a lifetime's habits he could never escape. In Rome, he continued to dine lavishly and collect curiosities, as if still surrounded by courtiers. The same compulsions that once defined his monarchy followed him into exile, transforming royal grandeur into quiet melancholy. King Farouk's addictions were less about substances and more about the hunger for control, a desire to own, to consume, to fill the emptiness that power itself could not satisfy. His downfall marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the symbolic death of royal indulgence in the modern Middle East. And as the world turned its gaze from the palaces of Cairo to the glittering courts of Europe, another monarch, this time in London, was waging his own secret battle against dependence, hidden behind the velvet curtains of British respectability and the scent of laudanum. 9. George IV, King of the United Kingdom, e. 1820 to 1830. Few monarchs have embodied both the brilliance and decay of royal excess like King George IV. He was in every sense a man of contradictions, elegant yet indulgent, charming yet unstable, gifted with taste yet trapped by appetite. Known in his youth as the first gentleman of Europe, George possessed a magnetic flair for art, architecture and style. Yet beneath the polished surface of the Regency era's glitter lay an unspoken truth. His lifelong struggle with addiction, to alcohol, to laudanum, an opium tincture, and to the constant pursuit of sensory pleasure. From his earliest years as Prince of Wales, George's world revolved around performance. The Georgian court, with its salons and soirees, celebrated wit, charm and extravagance. He learned early that charisma was power and indulgence was its cost. His lifestyle, rich food, heavy drinking and endless parties, was legendary even before he became king. But as his body aged and his responsibilities grew heavier, his reliance on stimulants and sedatives deepened. Court physicians prescribed laudanum to ease his chronic bladder pain, a condition worsened by years of excess. What began as a medical necessity soon became a daily dependency. Laudanum, the fashionable painkiller of the age, carried a deceptive reputation. It was sold over the counter, used by poets and nobles alike, and treated as both medicine and luxury. But for George, it blurred the line between relief and escape. Combined with wine and brandy, it dulled his pain, but also clouded his judgment. His temper became erratic, his moods unpredictable, and his appearance increasingly disheveled. Courtiers whispered about the king's illness, but never named its cause. The royal bulletins spoke of gout and nerves, disguising the truth behind respectable euphemisms. Still, George's artistic and architectural legacy thrived amid his decline. His vision transformed Brighton's Marine Pavilion into an oriental fantasy of domes and chandeliers, and his patronage of the arts helped shape the aesthetic of an entire era. But the grandeur he created externally mirrored an internal deterioration. The prince who once dazzled London society with wit and refinement became a recluse surrounded by physicians and servants sworn to silence. Meals stretched into banquets for one. The king's nights were spent between bouts of insomnia and intoxicated reverie. Those who saw him privately described a tragic figure, brilliant yet broken, trapped within his own illusions of control. He remained acutely aware of his image, even in decline, insisting on the correct arrangement of candles, the right perfume, the perfect velvet drape. It was as if he could will refinement to mask his frailty. But behind closed doors, his laudanum bottle sat beside the crown jewels, a symbol of the monarchy's gilded fragility. George IV's decline was handled with deliberate secrecy. Palace staff destroyed personal correspondence, and medical records were carefully edited before release. Only decades later did biographers and medical historians piece together the scope of his dependency. Yet his story is not merely one of vice, it is the reflection of a broader age when the elite romanticized intoxication while pretending moral restraint. When George died in 1830, his empire mourned with polite ceremony, unaware of the fog that had shrouded his final years. His addictions had been silenced by court protocol, his image embalmed in marble and myth. But his legacy remained divided, a monarch who beautified Britain and degraded himself in equal measure. And as the smoke of laudanum cleared over Windsor, a new heir stepped forward, charming, sociable, and driven by vices of his own. Yet his addiction was not to medicine or alcohol, but to the thrill of the gaming table and the risk of scandal. Then, Edward VII, King of the United Kingdom, written in 1901 to 1910. When Edward VII ascended the throne at nearly 60 years old, he had already lived a lifetime in the shadow of scandal and scrutiny. For decades, as Prince of Wales, he had been the embodiment of both charm and controversy, a man whose reputation for style and sociability hid the compulsions that quietly shaped his life. His addiction was not to alcohol or narcotics, but to gambling, a passion so intense it became both pastime and peril. Behind the velvet curtains of London's clubs and country estates, Edward found in games of chance the thrill that politics and duty could never give him. Edward's gambling habit developed early, nurtured in the glittering but idle environment of the Victorian aristocracy. Forbidden from interfering in government and stifled by Queen Victoria's strict moral oversight, the young prince sought release in pleasures that offered excitement without consequence. Or so he believed. At Marlborough House, his London residence, evenings of cards, baccarat and betting became ritual. The prince's charm made him the centerpiece of every social gathering, and his appetite for risk was as magnetic as his laughter. The sums exchanged at his tables were enormous, but courtiers and friends treated his losses as part of his personality, a royal quirk that brought glamour to the dullness of propriety. But the illusion of harmless leisure began to crack in 1890 during the infamous Tranby Croft baccarat scandal. Edward was a guest at the Yorkshire estate when one of the players, Sir William Gordon Cumming, was accused of cheating. The ensuing trial, covered breathlessly by the press, shocked the nation, not because of the alleged crime, but because the future king himself had been present at the gaming table. Though Edward was not accused of wrongdoing, the revelation that he had participated in an illegal gambling event publicly tarnished his name. The newspapers that once praised his charm now whispered about moral hypocrisy. Within the palace, the scandal was treated as a near crisis. Advisors worked tirelessly to control the narrative, emphasizing the prince's dignity and his devotion to social reform. Queen Victoria, deeply displeased, viewed the episode as yet another confirmation of her son's unreliability. Yet even after the public humiliation, Edward's fascination with gambling never entirely faded. It simply became more discreet, confined to trusted circles and private clubs where loyalty ensured silence. When he finally became king in 1901, Edward sought to redefine his image. His reign ushered in the Edwardian era, an age of elegance, diplomacy, and renewed royal visibility. He proved to be a surprisingly effective monarch, charming foreign leaders and revitalizing Britain's global image. Yet the private man remained restless, forever drawn to the excitement of the unpredictable. Those who knew him best described a monarch who could not bear monotony, who found in cards and risk the same energy he brought to politics and social life. Edward VII's legacy, like the games he loved, balanced on chance, a reminder that even the most polished kings can be ruled by quiet compulsions. And beyond the English Channel, another royal court, equally glittering but far more fragile, was falling under the spell of temptation in the gilded salons of Versailles. 11. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France to 1793. Marie Antoinette remains one of history's most enduring symbols of opulence and downfall, a queen whose pleasures, real or exaggerated, came to define an era's collapse. Long before revolution toppled her world, she had already become a legend of excess, though not all of it was of her making. Among her private indulgences, the most persistent and well-documented was her addiction to gambling, an obsession that began innocently as a courtly amusement and grew into a consuming vice that drained her fortune and damaged her reputation. Born an Archduchess of Austria and married into the French royal family at just 14, Marie Antoinette entered Versailles as a foreigner expected to charm an entire nation. The court of Louis XVI was an environment of scrutiny and ritual, where every gesture carried political meaning. Isolated from her husband, who was more interested in locks and keys than in social life, the young queen sought companionship and distraction among the courtiers who surrounded her. Cards became her escape, offering both excitement and a sense of control that her ceremonial life denied her. Gambling was hardly unusual at Versailles. The aristocracy viewed gaming as a test of composure, a demonstration of grace under pressure. Nights at the royal tables could last until dawn, with courtiers wagering fortunes on a single hand of faro or 21. But for Marie Antoinette, the pastime became compulsion. Reports from courtiers describe her playing with feverish energy, laughing off enormous losses, and borrowing money from friends to continue the game. Ministers quietly complained that the Queen's gambling debts had reached sums large enough to strain the royal household's finances. When Louis XVI attempted to restrict her play, she simply shifted the gatherings to private salons, where the risk of public embarrassment was smaller but never absent. The deeper danger was political, not financial. France in the 1780s was burdened by debt, famine, and unrest, and rumors of the Queen's extravagance became a convenient symbol for everything wrong with the monarchy. Pamphleteers and caricaturists painted her as frivolous and heartless, inventing scandals that blurred truth and fantasy. Her love of cards was exaggerated into an image of endless waste. Madame Deficit, they called her, a queen who gambled while her people starved. The court's efforts to shield her, paying off her losses in silence, managing her image through portraits of maternal virtue, could not undo the damage once public resentment took hold. Ironically, Marie Antoinette's gambling addiction was far less destructive than the myth it inspired. For her, cards were a distraction from loneliness, a small rebellion against the suffocating formality of royal life. But perception proved more powerful than truth. In the public imagination, the deck of cards in her hand became a symbol of an empire's moral bankruptcy. By the time the revolution erupted, her days at the gaming table were long past, yet the whispers of excess followed her even to the guillotine. Her life and her addiction illustrate how private habits can become public weapons in times of unrest. And far beyond Versailles, in the glittering but somber palaces of Central Europe, another royal heir was quietly descending into his own spiral of dependence, this time not on cards, but on morphine and melancholy. 12. Crown Prince Rudolf, Austria-Hungary, 1889. Crown Prince Rudolf, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth of Austria, was born to inherit one of Europe's grandest empires, but not its happiness. From the outside, his life seemed gilded, a palace childhood, refined education, and the promise of imperial destiny. Yet inside, Rudolf was a restless and wounded soul, torn between the weight of duty and the pull of personal freedom. His dependence on alcohol and morphine was not the indulgence of a careless prince, but the symptom of deep disillusionment, a hidden struggle that mirrored the quiet decay of the Habsburg dynasty itself. Rudolf grew up in an environment of rigid discipline. His father's rule was cold and bureaucratic, defined by obedience and formality. His mother, Empress Elizabeth, though affectionate, was often absent, fleeing the suffocating court for travel and solitude. From an early age, Rudolf showed a sensitive and inquisitive mind. He was fascinated by science, politics, and literature, subjects that clashed with the conservative doctrines of his father's empire. This intellectual independence made him both admired and isolated, a modern thinker trapped within an ancient system. As he entered adulthood, Rudolf's inner conflict deepened. His arranged marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium began with optimism, but quickly dissolved into emotional distance. Burdened by loneliness and political frustration, he turned increasingly to alcohol to calm his nerves and to morphine to quiet his restless thoughts. The combination, prescribed at first for migraines and insomnia, soon became a dependency. Those closest to him noticed changes, his moods shifting between exuberance and despair, his eyes often clouded, his hands trembling during public ceremonies. At court, his condition was carefully concealed. Official records described nervous ailments, and palace doctors were sworn to secrecy. His father, the emperor, refused to acknowledge any weakness in the heir apparent. For the sake of dynastic image, Rudolph's instability was recast as overwork, his erratic behavior explained away as youthful intensity. Behind the scenes, friends and confidants tried to shield him, arranging lighter duties and encouraging travel, but nothing eased the prince's growing despondence. Rudolph's reliance on morphine reflected the broader culture of 19th century Europe, when the drug was both fashionable and misunderstood. In aristocratic circles, it was used as a cure-all for stress and melancholy. Yet in Rudolph's case, it became a quiet chain that bound him more tightly to despair. Letters from his final years reveal a man oscillating between hope for reform and resignation to futility. A visionary trapped in a court that prized decorum over honesty. Although his tragic end has long overshadowed his life, Rudolph's addiction tells a subtler story. Of a prince whose mind was ahead of his time, but whose spirit was crushed by expectation. He sought meaning in a world that demanded obedience, and when he could not find it, he sought refuge in oblivion. His struggle foreshadowed a broader truth about monarchy itself, that beneath the splendor of crowns and ceremonies, Europe's royal heirs were often prisoners of their own perfection. And in Bavaria, not far from Vienna's imperial glow, another king was succumbing to that same quiet prison, seeking escape not through revolution or reform, but through the soft oblivion of sleep induced by the bottle of a physician. 13. Ludwig II, King of Bavaria, or 1864 to 1886. King Ludwig II of Bavaria remains one of Europe's most fascinating monarchs, an enigmatic dreamer who built castles like fairy tales and vanished under circumstances still shrouded in mystery. He is remembered for Neuschwanstein, the romantic fortress rising from alpine mist, and for his obsessive devotion to art and music, especially the operas of Richard Wagner. Yet beneath his magnificent imagination lay a quiet struggle, a dependence on sedatives and sleeping draughts that grew alongside his isolation. His addiction, hidden carefully by palace doctors, became a symbol of his retreat from the world, a descent not into madness as rumor claimed, but into exhaustion and dependence. Ludwig's reign began with promise. Ascending the throne at just 18, he embodied the ideals of youth and beauty that romantic Europe adored. He spoke poetically of divine kingship and saw himself not as a politician, but as an artist king, a guardian of beauty in an age increasingly dominated by industry and militarism. But reality soon betrayed his vision. Political power in Bavaria had already been curtailed by the rise of the German Empire, and Ludwig's influence was largely ceremonial. Disillusioned, he withdrew into solitude, surrounding himself with artists, architects, and servants who would never challenge him. It was in these years of retreat that his health began to falter. Court physicians prescribed chloral hydrate and bromide compounds, common sedatives of the 19th century, to treat his insomnia and anxiety. What began as nightly medicine became a quiet dependency. The drugs dulled his senses, feeding his detachment from reality. Servants reported that the king often spent days in darkened rooms, emerging only at night to wander his palaces by candlelight. In letters, he spoke of weariness, of feeling a stranger among men, and of a yearning for rest beyond dreams. The Bavarian government, alarmed by his growing eccentricity and financial extravagance, sought to remove him from power. But even as officials schemed, Ludwig remained protected by loyal attendants who managed his medications and shielded his frailty from public view. In an era when the notion of a mentally or physically unwell monarch was unthinkable, his physicians balanced between care and concealment, keeping the king calm with sedatives while maintaining the illusion of composure. His dependency deepened in the final years of his reign. The sleepless nights lengthened, the doses increased, and his withdrawal from public life became total. Yet, to the outside world, Ludwig's eccentricity was easier to romanticize than his suffering. Visitors saw the castles he built as monuments to whimsy, not as sanctuaries for a man desperate for peace. The world called him Mad King Ludwig, but his private letters suggest not insanity, but sorrow and exhaustion. An artist trapped inside a crown he no longer wanted. When Ludwig was found dead in Lake Starnberg in 1886, official reports labeled it an accident. His physicians maintained silence, his correspondence was censored, and the truth of his final days remained buried. But the traces of his addiction linger in every marble hall he left behind. A reminder that even kings who dream of paradise must still wake to pain. And far to the north, another monarch, disciplined, brilliant, and fiercely rational, was waging his own quiet battle with dependence, one measured not in doses of sedative, but in pinches of snuff taken from boxes of gold. 14. Frederick II the Great, King of Prussia, 1740-1786. Frederick the Great is remembered as one of Europe's most formidable monarchs, an enlightened despot, philosopher, military strategist, and patron of culture. His leadership transformed Prussia into a major European power, and his intellect inspired generations of reformers. Yet beneath the armor of discipline and intellect, Frederick harbored a quieter, more personal dependency, an almost obsessive addiction to snuff, the powdered tobacco inhaled by the elite of the 18th century. What began as a fashionable habit became an enduring ritual, one that mirrored the king's restlessness and perfectionism. Snuff-taking was a common indulgence among Europe's aristocracy, but Frederick's devotion to it bordered on compulsion. He was rarely seen without a snuff-box in hand, and his private chambers were filled with hundreds of them, each exquisitely crafted from gold, porcelain, and precious stones. These boxes were not mere accessories, they were extensions of his personality, symbols of control and refinement in a world of ceaseless motion. Visitors to Sanssouci Palace often remarked that the king punctuated every conversation, letter, or military dispatch with a measured pinch of snuff. It was his comfort in moments of stress, his reward after victory, and his constant companion in solitude. Contemporaries noted the extent of his dependence. Courtiers recorded that Frederick consumed snuff in such quantities that it coated his cuffs and the furniture around him. His valet was said to keep a dedicated brush just to clean the residue from the royal uniform. Chroniclers described how his private study smelled perpetually of tobacco and paper, a scent that seemed to define his reign as much as cannon fire or court music. Physicians warned that the habit worsened his chronic cough and inflamed his sinuses, but Frederick dismissed such concerns with characteristic wit, claiming that snuff sharpens thought. Yet behind this casual bravado lay an undeniable compulsion. Snuff provided the king with a small but constant escape from the pressures of command. His reign was marked by endless wars, administrative reforms, and philosophical reflection, and the physical ritual of taking snuff became a rhythm of control in a life that allowed little rest. It was both stimulant and solace, a habit that suited the contradictions of a man who ruled with iron logic yet longed for the gentler world of music and poetry. Despite his addiction, Frederick maintained extraordinary productivity. He wrote extensively, composed music, corresponded with Voltaire, and managed his armies with precision that astonished Europe. His dependence never collapsed into dysfunction, but it revealed the humanity behind the legend, a reminder that even the most disciplined rulers needed some refuge from their burdens. In his later years, as illness and isolation closed around him, Frederick's snuff-taking intensified. Servants filled his boxes each morning as faithfully as they carried his sword. To outsiders, this small ritual seemed harmless, almost quaint, but to those who knew him, it was a quiet testimony to fatigue, a king sustained by powdered tobacco and iron willpower. And while Prussia's philosopher king sought relief in his ornate boxes of snuff farther southwest, another monarch of Europe, born into Spain's twilight of grandeur, was courting his own kind of addiction, one defined not by powder or smoke, but by the glittering seduction of the gambling table. 15. Alfonso III, King of Spain, 1886 to 1931. King Alfonso XIV came into the world already wearing a crown. His father had died before his birth, making him king from the moment he drew breath. His life, therefore, was a performance written long before he could speak. The Bourbon monarchy he inherited was fragile, bound by old traditions, but shaken by modern politics. Alfonso's reign would stretch across wars, scandals, and the slow unraveling of royal authority in Spain. Yet amid the turbulence, he developed a private refuge from the pressures of rule, an addiction to gambling and the pursuit of pleasure that would erode his credibility and hasten his fall from grace. From a young age, Alfonso was restless and impulsive, qualities that initially endeared him to his people. Handsome, charming, and athletic, he cultivated the image of a modern monarch, racing automobiles, attending bullfights, and mingling with both nobles and commoners. Yet the same appetite for excitement that made him popular also drove him toward excess. Cards, horse races, and casinos became central to his social life. He was known to wager enormous sums on games of chance, often losing without visible concern. To his companions, his recklessness was thrilling. To his ministers, it was troubling. The king seemed incapable of moderation, finding in risk a brief escape from the constraints of politics. Gambling, however, was only part of Alfonso's broader addiction to extravagance. His private circle, known as La Peña, revolved around late-night parties, fine dining, and gossip that scandalized the more conservative elements of Spanish society. The royal household managed the fallout discreetly, ensuring that debts were paid and rumors suppressed. But in an age of growing media scrutiny, whispers could not stay buried for long. Newspapers in Madrid began hinting at royal indulgences and costly distractions. Even foreign correspondents took notice, describing Alfonso as a king more interested in pleasure than governance. Behind these reports was a deeper loneliness. Alfonso's marriage to Queen Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, began with promise but soured after personal tragedies, including the birth of a haemophiliac heir. The couple drifted apart, and the king sought solace in diversions that numbed his disappointment. Gambling offered him a world where fortune could change with a turn of a card, a realm of chance beyond politics or fate. It was a dangerous comfort, one that dulled his awareness of how swiftly Spain itself was changing. As political unrest intensified, Alfonso's addiction to leisure became a metaphor for his detachment from reality. When the monarchy fell in 1931 and the Second Republic was proclaimed, he departed Spain quietly, leaving behind a nation exhausted by dictatorship and division. In exile, he continued to gamble, though on a smaller scale. His fortunes diminished, but his habits unchanged. Alfonso XIII's legacy is one of charm shadowed by indulgence, a ruler undone not by cruelty, but by distraction. His addiction was not born of malice but of escape, a yearning for control in a world slipping beyond his grasp. In the end, his life became a cautionary tale for modern monarchs, that the crown's greatest threat may not come from rebellion or revolution, but from the quiet seduction of luxury itself. And as Spain's royal light dimmed, far to the east another sovereign of an older empire and a different faith was waging a subtler battle with the very same temptation, his palace perfumed with wine and politics hidden behind veils of sanctity. 16. Shah Abbas I, Safavid Iran Bahrain, 1588 to 1629. Among the great monarchs of the Islamic world, few shine as brightly or as paradoxically as Shah Abbas the Great. He was a visionary who transformed Iran into a center of art, trade, and power, a ruler who built the magnificent city of Isfahan and filled it with mosques, gardens, and bazaars that dazzled foreign visitors. Yet behind the glittering facade of empire, Abbas concealed a private indulgence that shadowed his otherwise disciplined reign, his deep and chronic dependence on wine, a habit that blurred the boundaries between pleasure, politics, and piety. In the Safavid court, alcohol occupied a complicated space. the empire was officially guided by Shia Islam, which prohibited intoxication, yet the upper echelons of society often indulged behind closed doors. Wine symbolized refinement and sophistication, appearing in Persian poetry as both metaphor and delight. Abbas, who admired the cultural elegance of these traditions, embraced the courtly drinking customs with enthusiasm. He was known to host elaborate feasts where poets, painters, and musicians gathered under golden lanterns, cups filled with ruby-colored Shiraz wine. To guests, these gatherings seemed like mere celebration of art and friendship, but for the Shah, they gradually became a personal ritual, a rare escape from the crushing solitude of kingship. Contemporary chroniclers treaded carefully when describing the Shah's drinking habits. The official histories, commissioned by Abbas himself, glorified his piety and devotion, presenting him as a just ruler guided by divine wisdom. But private diaries and accounts by European envoys, such as the travelers Pietro della Valle and Thomas Herbert, paint a subtler picture of a monarch both majestic and human, one who loved wine too deeply for a man bound by faith. The Shah's attendants were ordered to keep his indulgence discreet, cellars stocked, goblets refilled silently, and servants sworn to secrecy. Abbas's addiction was not one of reckless debauchery, but of weary ritual. The burdens of empire were immense: endless wars with the Ottomans and Uzbeks, constant vigilance against internal rebellion, and the ever-present paranoia of assassination. His glass of wine, often taken in the still hours of the night, became a companion, a balm against insomnia, anxiety, and the loneliness of absolute power. Courtiers observed that his demeanor softened after drinking. His speeches became more poetic, his laughter freer. Yet as the years passed, the habit took its toll. His health declined, and his temper grew unpredictable. Those who displeased him could face swift punishment, though the chronicles softened such episodes into vague warnings about royal melancholy. Even as his body weakened, Abbas maintained his grip on the empire. He restructured the army, reformed administration, and built monumental architecture that still stands as testament to his brilliance. The contradiction of his life between faith and indulgence, restraint and desire, was mirrored in his court itself. Outwardly devout, inwardly decadent. When he died in 1629, the chronicles described him as a saintly reformer, omitting any mention of the bottles and goblets that had accompanied him through long nights of contemplation. Shah Abbas's secret vice never erased his greatness, but it added a shadow to it, a reminder that even the strongest rulers seek comfort in weakness. His reign fused spiritual ambition with human vulnerability, creating an image both dazzling and tragic. And as Persia's palaces dimmed after his passing, the echoes of that contradiction would reappear centuries later in another Ottoman ruler, a reformer who preached moderation, but whose private life swirled once more around the forbidden pleasures of the cup. 17. Selim XXX, Ottoman Sultan Boris, 1789 to 1807. When Selim III came to power in 1789, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self, still grand in ceremony, yet increasingly fragile in reality. The young Sultan, educated in poetry, philosophy, and music, dreamed of breathing new life into a realm burdened by centuries of inertia. His vision was bold: to reform the army, modernize the bureaucracy, and open the empire to the ideas of the Enlightenment. Yet even as he preached renewal and discipline, Selim struggled privately with an addiction that reflected the contradictions of his time, a quiet but persistent dependence on wine and the convivial indulgence it brought. In public, Selim projected the image of a pious and enlightened monarch. He corresponded with European rulers, sent ambassadors abroad, and filled his court with musicians and scholars. He composed music himself, leaving behind dozens of classical Ottoman works that are still performed today. His devotion to art and reform inspired admiration from intellectuals across the empire. Yet those closest to him knew that the same sensitivity that made him visionary also made him fragile. The pressures of reform, constant resistance from the Janissaries, the conservative ulama, and even members of his own family drove the Sultan into bouts of melancholy and self-doubt. And in those moments of weariness, the solace of wine became irresistible. The Ottoman court of the late 18th century was not a place of open indulgence. Officially, alcohol was banned under Islamic law, but in the privacy of the imperial palaces, exceptions were made for those of high rank. Servants who attended Selim's nightly gatherings spoke in whispers of poetic salons, evenings filled with music, verse, and discreet intoxication. The Sultan would sit cross-legged on embroidered cushions, surrounded by trusted courtiers, sipping from crystal goblets disguised with sherbet. He insisted that these occasions were not sinful pleasure, but inspiration, moments when the mind, freed from anxiety, could imagine more clearly the future of the empire. Still, the double life was not without danger. His moral critics used rumors of his drinking as political ammunition, portraying him as a man seduced by Western corruption. They claimed that his reforms were not born of reason, but of indulgence, that his admiration for Europe was proof of moral decay. Such whispers fed the growing unrest among the Janissaries, who already viewed his modernization efforts as a threat to their privileges. The court chroniclers, bound by loyalty, recorded none of this directly. Instead, they described his nocturnal musings and melancholic vigils in poetic euphemisms. As Selim's reforms faltered, so did his peace of mind. His reliance on wine deepened, not as a path to pleasure, but as an escape from failure. Those who served him said the Sultan often sat alone at dawn, the remnants of a half-drained cup beside him, gazing out over the Bosporus as if searching for a future that refused to arrive. In 1807, when rebellion finally erupted and he was deposed, the court remained silent about his private vices. His legacy was rewritten as that of a martyr for reform, a man too gentle and idealistic for the brutality of politics. Selim III's story is less one of moral weakness than of human vulnerability. His drinking mirrored his empire's contradictions, aspiring to modern enlightenment while chained to old habits and fears. He sought inspiration in the cup, believing it could help him build a better world, but it became instead a mirror of the empire's slow intoxication with its own illusions. And as the Ottoman palace lights dimmed, another imperial ruler, this time in the far north, would take indulgence to extremes that left no room for disguise, transforming his court into the most notorious theatre of excess in European history. 18. Peter I the Great, Tsar of Russia, R. 1682 to 1725. Peter the Great stands as one of history's most commanding reformers, a man who dragged Russia from medieval isolation into the dawn of modern Europe. He built cities from swamps, restructured armies, and forced his nobles to trade their beards for European manners. Yet behind the image of tireless energy and progress lay another side to his personality, a relentless need for stimulation that manifested in his notorious indulgence in alcohol. What began as camaraderie and celebration evolved into an enduring dependence that shaped both his court and his health, concealed beneath the brilliance of his accomplishments. Peter's fascination with Western culture began early. In his youth, he traveled incognito through Europe on what became known as the Grand Embassy, studying shipbuilding, science, and military technology. He worked alongside common laborers in the docks of Amsterdam and absorbed the sociable customs of Western courts, including their drinking habits. Upon returning to Russia, Peter combined reform with revelry. He introduced new uniforms, academies, and taxes, but also imported barrels of European spirits and turned his court into a curious blend of innovation and excess. His circle of companions, known ironically as the all-drunken synod of fools and jesters, held raucous banquets that mocked religious rituals and parodied church ceremonies with overflowing goblets. Though these events have often been portrayed as mere entertainment, they reflected something deeper in Peter's character, a need to dissolve the constant strain of rule through ritualized indulgence. He was rarely seen without a glass in hand, and his tolerance for alcohol became legendary. Foreign envoys wrote with astonishment of the Tsar's ability to outdrink entire entourages while continuing to discuss naval strategy or administrative reform with sharp precision. Yet the drinking took its toll. As the years passed, the endless feasting and sleepless nights eroded Peter's health. Physicians noted his frequent fevers, tremors, and swelling, symptoms that modern historians now associate with chronic liver disease. Still, his court concealed the extent of his decline. Official bulletins emphasized his vigor and triumphs, while servants quietly managed his growing dependency. No one dared question the emperor's habits. To do so would be seen as treason against the man who had made Russia an empire. Despite his excesses, Peter's achievements were undeniable. He founded St. Petersburg, reformed education, modernized the military, and expanded Russian trade across the seas. His dynamism seemed inexhaustible, but it came at a personal cost. Alcohol dulled the exhaustion of constant reform, yet it also amplified his volatility. Courtiers spoke of unpredictable mood swings, moments of magnanimity turning suddenly to rage. Behind the scenes, those closest to him learned that the price of proximity to Peter was enduring the storm of his temper, a storm that grew more violent as his body weakened. When Peter died in 1725, the official narrative celebrated him as a titan, a man who had reshaped the world. But among those who had served him privately, there was another understanding, that even the greatest modernizer of Russia had been consumed by the very force he believed he could control: excess. His addiction did not destroy his empire, but it exposed the contradiction at its heart: progress built upon personal chaos. Peter's death marked both the triumph and tragedy of his age. The city he carved from marshland became his monument, a beacon of enlightenment rising over the Baltic, but also a reminder that reform born from willpower alone can corrode the man who wields it. And as Russia entered the era of absolute monarchy, another northern court, more restrained in its politics but equally haunted by its ruler's dependence, was preparing to conceal the unraveling of a king whose crown sat atop a mind slipping into drink and delusion. 19. Christian VII, King of Denmark-Norway, reign of 1766-1808. Christian VII of Denmark-Norway was born into a world of royal polish and ceremony, yet from the beginning his life was marked by fragility. Crowned at 17, he inherited a stable kingdom, but not the steadiness of mind or body needed to rule it. His reign would become one of the most enigmatic in Scandinavian history, a tragic blend of brilliance, vulnerability, and concealment. Behind the grandeur of Copenhagen's Amalienborg Palace, the young king battled a quiet dependence on alcohol, encouraged and enabled by a court desperate to keep him docile and dignified. As a child, Christian showed sensitivity and intelligence, but also bouts of nervousness and erratic behavior. His father's court emphasized rigid discipline, and his tutors, following the harsh methods of the time, believed that strict control would strengthen his character. Instead, it deepened his insecurity. When he became king in 1766, his immaturity was immediately apparent. He possessed curiosity and charm, but lacked the focus to govern. His counselors and physicians began supplying him with wine to calm his nerves during public appearances. What began as a coping mechanism became an ingrained habit that followed him into every chamber of state. At first, the effects were discreet. The king's erratic moods were explained as melancholy, his distracted demeanor as poetic temperament. Courtiers shielded his weaknesses, adjusting his schedule to mask his condition. Yet as the years passed, Christian's reliance on drink worsened. Alcohol provided temporary escape from the anxiety that plagued him, but it also intensified his instability. The same palace that once echoed with his laughter now filled with whispers of unease. Into this chaos stepped a figure who would define Christian's reign: Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician appointed as royal doctor. Struensee recognized that the king's health and behavior were symptoms of deeper psychological distress. While attempting to manage Christians' drinking, he gradually gained influence, guiding Denmark through a wave of Enlightenment-inspired reforms, freedom of the press, public education, and legal modernization. Yet this extraordinary chapter in Danish history was built on a secret foundation of concealment. The public saw a rejuvenated monarchy. Few realized that the king himself was increasingly incapacitated, and that his addiction remained an unspoken burden. After Struensee's downfall in 1772, engineered by conservative nobles and the Queen Dowager, Christian's fragile state worsened. The physicians who replaced Struensee reverted to old habits, numbing the king's nerves rather than treating them. Isolated and fearful, Christian spent his later years in quiet confinement, his crown reduced to ceremony. The court ensured that bulletins described him as indisposed or reflective, avoiding any mention of dependence. The illusion of dignity was preserved even as the king faded behind it. By the time of his death in 1808, Christian's seventh reign had become a cautionary tale of monarchy's cost, the suffocation of a human being beneath the weight of ritual, expectation, and secrecy. His addiction was never recorded in official histories, but it was woven into every decision made in his name. And across the North Sea, another monarch of the same century, a ruler known for wit, charm, and gambling tables glittering with gold, would embrace his vices not in secrecy, but as spectacle, turning indulgence into identity and the royal court into a theatre of chance. 20. Charles II, King of England, Scotland and Ireland, e. 1660 to 1685. When Charles II returned to England in 1660, after years of exile, he brought with him not just the restoration of monarchy, but the restoration of indulgence. His court became a carnival of laughter, wit and pleasure, a deliberate reaction against the dour austerity of the Puritan Commonwealth that had executed his father. To his subjects, he was the merry monarch, a man of charm and vitality who revived the theatre, encouraged science, and filled London with a sense of freedom it had long forgotten. Yet beneath the surface of merriment lay an unspoken truth. Charles's reign was one long dance with excess, and his quiet addiction was to gambling and diversion, habits that consumed his attention and shaped the tone of his kingdom. Charles's years in exile had taught him to rely on charm and chance for survival. He lived as a wanderer across Europe, dependent on the generosity of foreign courts, learning how to adapt, flatter, and amuse. When he regained his throne, he sought to make life itself a game of chance that he could finally control. Cards, dice, and wagers became his nightly companions. In Whitehall Palace, gaming rooms sparkled with candlelight as nobles and courtesans surrounded the king, their laughter and bets mingling with the strains of music. Charles rarely played small. His wagers were grand, often reckless, and his losses astronomical. Yet his easy grace disarmed critics. He laughed at misfortune, paying debts with the same nonchalance with which he incurred them. To the public, his indulgence became legend. Satirists mocked his late mornings and endless nights, while moralists despaired that the king who had restored the Church of England spent more time in gaming halls than at prayer. Still, Charles's popularity endured because he offered his people something rare after decades of civil war: lightness. The court, with all its flaws, felt alive again. Gambling was not hidden. It was celebrated as a royal art, a reflection of wit and boldness. But what the world did not see was the quiet exhaustion behind the mask. Each night's revelry numbed the burden of governance. Each coin tossed on the table, another escape from the ghosts of his family's bloody past. Charles's addiction to chance mirrored his approach to politics. He ruled with flexibility rather than conviction, shifting alliances and policies like a player adjusting to a changing deck. It was a skill that kept him on the throne, but left the nation uncertain of his principles. Behind the charm, there was restlessness, a man forever seeking movement, distraction, and novelty. In his later years, the toll became clear. The once vigorous monarch grew heavy with fatigue, his laughter more forced, his nights longer and less joyous. Physicians warned of declining health, yet the rhythms of indulgence continued almost by habit. When he died in 1685, courtiers remembered not a tyrant or a martyr, but a man who had turned his life into one grand wager, staking peace against pleasure. Charles II's addiction was not one of self-destruction, but of evasion, an endless chase for delight to drown out disillusion. He governed through charm as he gambled with fate, leaving behind a legacy both radiant and fragile. And across the Channel, another French monarch, whose own palace glittered even more than Whitehall, was following a similar path, where gambling was not rebellion but ritual, and luxury itself had become a quiet form of dependence. 21. Louis XV, King of France from 1715 to 1774. Louis XV, the great-grandson of the Sun King, ascended to the French throne as a child, and inherited a realm gilded with power, yet shadowed by decadence. His reign would last nearly 60 years, encompassing both the height and the hollowing of Bourbon glory. While history remembers him for political stagnation and romantic intrigue, one of his most enduring private dependencies was his addiction to gambling, a passion that consumed the royal court and mirrored the slow unraveling of France itself. From his earliest years, Louis was surrounded by ritual and luxury. The court of Versailles was a meticulously choreographed theatre of etiquette, where every gesture had symbolic weight. Yet for the young monarch, the grandeur soon became suffocating. Trained to project divine composure, he found escape in the one realm where fortune ruled instead of protocol, the gaming tables. Cards, dice, and lotteries became his personal theatre, a world where fate could be courted and defied without consequence. At Versailles, gambling was not merely tolerated, it was institutionalized. Evenings at the royal apartments often ended with rounds of Pharaon or Basset, games where nobles risked fortunes while maintaining impeccable manners. For Louis, these sessions were more than amusement. They were release. He played obsessively, often for hours after midnight, the soft shuffle of cards mingling with the hum of courtiers eager to please him. Chroniclers recorded entire estates won and lost in a single night, fortunes redistributed at the flick of a card. When the king's luck turned sour, the treasury discreetly absorbed his debts. While his people faced rising taxes and food shortages, Louis's court seemed suspended in its own glittering bubble. His ministers, aware of public discontent, tried to curb his play, but few dared confront the monarch directly. Gambling had become part of royal identity, a symbol of aristocratic ease and detachment. To the courtiers, matching the king's wages was a sign of loyalty. To moralists and pamphleteers outside the palace, it was evidence of corruption. The French public began to see the king not as a ruler of divine right, but as a man frittering away the wealth of his nation in games of chance. Yet for Louis, gambling offered more than pleasure. It provided a fragile illusion of control. He had inherited his throne young, ruled under the guidance of others, and spent much of his life surrounded by manipulation. At the card table, he could at least pretend to command fate, but the more he played, the more he surrendered to the same randomness he sought to master. In his later years, wearied by age and scandal, Louis withdrew from public life. His once lavish gambling sessions grew rarer, replaced by private games among trusted companions. The debts remained, the illusion lingered, and the reputation stuck. A monarch of grace who had gambled away not just fortunes but faith in his crown. When Louis XV died in 1774, the court still glittered, but the spirit of reverence that had sustained the monarchy was gone. His addiction, like his reign, symbolized the emptiness that luxury could no longer conceal. And across the Iberian Peninsula, another royal court, one smaller but no less devoted to the gaming table, was cultivating its own lineage of chance, where kings wagered not merely gold but the credibility of their thrones. 22. Miguel I, King of Portugal, around 1828 to 1834. Miguel the Fifth of Portugal was a monarch shaped by contradiction, a man who began as a champion of conservative absolutism and ended his life in quiet exile, sustained by the same habits of indulgence that had comforted him during his brief, tumultuous reign. Known to history as Miguel the Absolutist, he ruled a kingdom divided by ideology, torn between the traditional monarchy he defended and the constitutional order his brother Pedro sought to impose. Yet behind the fiery politics and proclamations of divine right, Miguel nurtured a secret addiction to gambling and high-stakes living, a vice that mirrored the instability of both his temperament and his time. As a prince, Miguel's education combined religious orthodoxy with military rigor. He was groomed to be disciplined, patriotic, and devout, a perfect soldier king for a Portugal weary of Napoleonic invasions. But discipline at court was often a matter of appearance. From his youth, Miguel was drawn to the glitter of aristocratic diversions, lavish banquets, music, and games of chance. In Lisbon's royal salons, gambling was not seen as vice but as a gentleman's pastime, a social art that tested composure and wit. Miguel excelled at it, charming his companions and earning a reputation as both daring and lucky. When he seized the throne in 1828, after years of political struggle, Miguel portrayed himself as a pious monarch chosen by God to restore order. Yet ruling required a steadiness that his restless nature could not sustain. The pressures of rebellion, foreign interference, and financial crisis weighed heavily on him. As the liberals advanced and alliances crumbled, the king sought solace in the familiar thrill of gaming. Evenings in the palace often stretched into dawn, the sounds of dice and laughter mingling with distant reports of unrest. Ministers fretted as the royal treasury shrank while soldiers went unpaid. Gambling, for Miguel, was not only escape, it was metaphor. Each wager reflected his belief that fate would eventually favor him, just as he believed divine providence would preserve his throne. But the odds of politics were crueler than the odds of cards. By 1834, his armies were defeated, his supporters scattered, and his throne lost. Forced into exile, Miguel carried his habits with him to Italy and later to Germany, where he lived comfortably but without influence. In the salons of Vienna and Rome, he continued to gamble, surrounded by nostalgic courtiers who still addressed him as Your Majesty. In exile, Miguel's addiction became his last ritual of control. The stakes were smaller now, the tables quieter, but the compulsion remained, the desire to outplay fortune, to feel for a moment that chance still obeyed his will. He died in 1866, a king without a kingdom, but still a player at the table, his faith in luck unbroken. Miguel the Fifth's story is a reminder that addiction often grows from the same soil as ambition. His reign, brief and reckless, reflected a man who gambled with everything, his crown, his country, and his legacy, and lost them all to fate's indifferent hand. And in neighbouring Spain, another monarch would follow a similar path. A younger king who, amid the glitter of restored monarchy and the rising hum of modernity, would turn his life into a spectacle of wagers, passions, and ruinous fortune. 23. Alfonso XII, King of Spain, pronounced 1874-1885. Alfonso XII of Spain came to the throne at a time when his nation was weary of conflict, instability, and endless political experiment. His reign, though short, promised calm, a new era after years of civil war and revolution. Yet beneath the outward image of discipline and reform, Alfonso wrestled with private habits that reflected the same yearning for relief that haunted many monarchs of his century. His quiet addiction to gambling and late-night leisure became a mirror of both personal escape and political contradiction. A young king trying to embody renewal while privately seeking refuge from the pressures of restoration. Born in exile in 1857, Alfonso was the son of Queen Isabella II, whose own reign had collapsed amid scandal and rebellion. From childhood, he lived as a displaced heir, moving between Paris and Vienna, where he was educated under strict discipline. When Spain recalled him to the throne in 1874, after the brief experiment with a republic, he entered Madrid as a symbol of hope, youthful, polished, and modern. The newspapers called him El Pacificador, the peacemaker, yet few realized how unprepared he was for the exhausting weight of expectation that would define his decade-long rule. The Spanish Restoration demanded both strength and restraint. Alfonso faced fractious politics, economic strain, and regional unrest. Every decision was scrutinized by liberals and conservatives alike. His marriage to Queen Maria de las Mercedes briefly softened his life, but her sudden death left him desolate. Courtiers noted that the tragedy changed him profoundly. His public warmth gave way to private melancholy. To dull his grief and the loneliness of kingship, he turned increasingly to the distractions of the aristocratic world. Card games, hunting, and private gatherings where gambling replaced conversation. At first, his indulgence seemed harmless, a youthful pursuit shared with friends and generals. But as the years passed, the habit deepened. The king's love of games of chance became a whispered concern within the palace. Ministers arranged his finances carefully to conceal the scale of his losses. Newspapers, loyal to the monarchy, avoided mention of it altogether. Gambling provided Alfonso with the illusion of control, a respite from the endless compromise of politics. Yet it also mirrored the uncertainty of his reign, a balancing act between reform and tradition, chance and calculation. Despite these personal failings, Alfonso XII was not an idle ruler. He worked diligently to stabilize Spain, reorganize its institutions, and reduce military rebellions. But the strain of restoring a fragile nation wore heavily on his health. By his late 20s, he suffered from exhaustion and illness, likely worsened by irregular habits and sleepless nights spent at gaming tables. When he died in 1885 at just 27, his people mourned deeply, remembering him as the king who had briefly united Spain's warring factions. The court preserved his image as a model of duty and grace, leaving no hint of the private weaknesses that humanized him. Alfonso XII's addiction was modest compared to the decadence of other royal houses, yet it spoke of the same ancient truth, that even the most disciplined rulers sought comfort in uncertainty, a brief escape from the relentless weight of destiny. And in the golden age of Habsburg Spain, centuries before Alfonso's fragile peace, another monarch had already set the precedent, one whose passion for games and theatre blurred the line between statecraft and escapism, a king who wagered both his fortune and his empire on luck. 24. Philip IV, King of Spain, 1621 to 1665. Philip IV's reign marked the twilight of Spain's golden age, a time when the empire's vast territories stretched across the globe, yet its power at home was quietly unraveling. A patron of art, theatre and literature, Philip surrounded himself with genius. Velázquez painted his portraits, Calderón wrote his plays. But behind the cultured facade lay a monarch increasingly trapped by indulgence and fatigue. His addiction was not to violence or conquest, but to gambling and diversion, the glittering amusements that dulled the weight of empire and numbed the pain of inevitable decline. Ascending the throne at 16, Philip was initially hailed as a model of dignity and promise. His reign began under the guidance of the ambitious minister Count Duke of Olivares, who sought to restore Spain's power through reform and war. But while Olivares labored to rebuild the empire's finances and military, the young king drifted toward the comforts of court life. Gambling, already a fashionable pastime among the aristocracy, became Philip's favored escape. The palaces of Madrid, particularly the Buen Retiro, transformed into spaces of entertainment where courtiers, nobles, and foreign envoys gathered to wager fortunes beneath frescoed ceilings. The king's tables were set nightly for games of napes and trick-track, with stakes high enough to equal a soldier's yearly pay. At first, it was harmless, a show of royal generosity, a means of social grace. But as losses mounted and debts multiplied, the indulgence became routine. Ministers noted that crucial state councils were postponed or shortened to accommodate his gaming sessions. The Count Duke, who once tolerated the pastime to keep his sovereign content, grew alarmed as gambling began to influence political favour. Courtiers who flattered the king at the card table found themselves rewarded with titles and offices. The deeper irony was that Philip's dependence on gambling mirrored the empire's own relationship with risk. Spain's fortunes were tied to uncertain ventures, the treasure fleets, colonial wars, and speculative taxation schemes that propped up a decaying economy. Each new campaign was a wager against fate, each victory bought on borrowed gold. The king's private games became an echo of his empire's public gamble. As the decades passed, Spain's failures in war against the Dutch, the French, and its own rebels drained both treasury and morale. Philip sought solace in increasingly elaborate entertainments, masked balls, comedies, and tournaments. His court, dazzling in its artistry, became known throughout Europe as the most splendid and most idle. Chroniclers, careful to protect the monarch's dignity, referred to his evenings of repose, rather than the reality of endless gaming. Only foreign observers, like the Venetian ambassadors, dared to hint at how much time and treasure the king lost to cards. By the end of his reign, Philip's health and spirit were worn thin. His once handsome face aged prematurely, his kingdom fractured by debt and defeat. Yet even in those weary final years, the gambling continued, habitual, ceremonial, as much a part of monarchy as prayer or council. The dealers changed, the stakes shifted, but the ritual endured. Philip IV's addiction was not merely personal, it was emblematic of a dynasty unable to confront its decline. He played with cards as his ancestors had played with continents, convinced that fortune could still be persuaded to smile once more. And when his crown passed to his young and fragile heir, Spain's royal weakness only deepened, preparing the stage for another monarch across the sea, a sailor king of Britain whose early life of heavy drink would test whether discipline could ever conquer indulgence. 25. William IV, King of the United Kingdom, or 1830 to 1837. William IV, often remembered as the Sailor King, ruled for only 7 years, but his life before the throne was long, colourful, and marked by a combination of vigour, humour, and restless appetite. Born the third son of George III, he was never expected to become king, and that freedom allowed him to live as he pleased, first as a naval officer, then as a man of indulgent habits. His lifelong fondness for drink and convivial living, though moderated in later years, shaped both his reputation and his reign. The addiction that defined his youth was carefully softened in the official memory of the crown, yet it lingered in the whispers of courtiers and the margins of history. William entered the Royal Navy at 13, serving across the Caribbean and North America during a time when naval culture was inseparable from alcohol. Rum and wine were daily rations, and camaraderie was forged over casks rather than councils. The young prince embraced the life wholeheartedly, brash, jovial, and quick to laughter, earning the affection of sailors who found him more approachable than any royal before him. But the same easygoing temperament that endeared him to his crew also encouraged excess. Reports from his superiors occasionally mentioned his enthusiasm for the bottle, though couched in the language of affection rather than censure. For a young man far from courtly restraint, drinking was not vice, but habit. When he returned to England, William carried that culture with him. As Duke of Clarence, he was notorious for hosting noisy dinners, often filled with laughter, song, and overflowing glasses. His relationship with actress Dorothea Jordan, with whom he had 10 children, added to his image as the most unpretentious and least disciplined member of the royal family. Yet even amid this chaos, there was warmth. William was known for generosity and sincerity, qualities that made his eventual accession to the throne unexpectedly welcome. When he became king in 1830 at age 64, the habits of his youth lingered, but in diminished form. He no longer drank to wild excess, though wine and spirits remained fixtures of his table. His doctors quietly encouraged moderation, and his queen, Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, brought a stabilizing influence to his domestic life. Still, the traces of his old sailor's conviviality remained. Ministers occasionally complained of meetings held after heavy dinners, where the king's conversation drifted between humour and impatience. Despite these quirks, William's reign was marked by surprising diligence. He oversaw the passage of the Reform Act of 1832, which expanded parliamentary representation and paved the way for modern democracy. He approached the throne with sincerity, if not brilliance, aware that his duty was to serve rather than to dominate. Yet his public image as a jovial, rough-edged monarch persisted, a reflection of the life he had once lived. When William IV died in 1837, he left behind a Britain on the cusp of transformation and a monarchy soon to be redefined by his niece, Queen Victoria. His indulgence had mellowed into humanity, his weaknesses tempered by age. Still, the Sailor King remained a symbol of a fading era, the last monarch who could laugh, drink, and live openly without the polished restraint expected of the modern crown. And beyond Britain's grey skies, in the heart of Europe, another king's extravagance would take indulgence to its darkest moral depths, not in the taverns of sailors or the clubs of London, but in the palaces of Brussels, where pleasure and cruelty became indistinguishable beneath the glitter of empire. 26. Leopold II, King of the Belgians, after 1865 to 1909. Leopold II of Belgium ruled a small European nation, but dreamed of an empire vast enough to rival those of Britain and France. His ambition made him a titan of expansion, yet it also revealed the darker recesses of obsession and indulgence. While history remembers him for the atrocities committed in the Congo Free State, a private colonial project masked as philanthropy, his personal life was governed by another form of dependence, an addiction to luxury, excess and control that blurred the boundary between indulgence and delusion. His pleasures were not chemical but psychological, expressed through compulsive extravagance, secrecy, and a craving for dominance that touched every corner of his reign. From his earliest years, Leopold was marked by dissatisfaction. As the son of Belgium's first king, he inherited a throne limited by constitutional checks and the realities of a small industrialized country. The Belgian monarchy was ceremonial. Leopold, however, yearned to be imperial. This longing for grandeur shaped his every decision and habit. He built sprawling estates, collected art, and surrounded himself with symbols of empire, gold, marble, silks, and exotic curiosities. The court whispered that the king's appetite for opulence bordered on mania. The palaces of Laeken and the Côte d'Azur glittered with imported finery, while his mistresses were adorned with jewels rivaling those of queens. His addiction to wealth and power found its ultimate expression in the Congo. Officially, the colony was established as a humanitarian mission to bring civilization and commerce to Africa. In truth, it was Leopold's personal possession, governed by a network of brutal administrators who enriched the king through forced labor and the extraction of ivory and rubber. Even as reports of abuse began to circulate, Leopold maintained a carefully crafted public image of benevolent reform. The Belgian press, influenced by royal patronage, portrayed him as a modernizer, pious, industrious, and selfless. Behind that facade, however, the king's correspondence revealed his relentless obsession with profit. He demanded constant updates on revenue, berated his agents for inefficiency, and treated the colony as a private treasury for funding his monumental projects in Europe. Leopold's compulsions extended into his personal relationships. His marriage to Queen Marie Henriette grew cold and estranged, while his romantic entanglements, most famously with the young Parisian courtesan Blanche Delacroix, whom he styled Baroness de Vaughan, scandalized Europe. The relationship epitomized his need to possess and control. Though his advisors begged him to end the affair for the sake of dignity, he refused, shielding Blanche with wealth and titles until his death. In his final years, Leopold became increasingly isolated, surrounded only by luxury and suspicion. His vast fortune, built on suffering, brought him no peace. When he died in 1909, the Belgian government seized the Congo from his estate, converting it into a formal colony. His funeral was met not with reverence, but with public silence. Citizens turned their backs as the procession passed, a symbolic act of rejection. Leopold II's addiction was one of grandeur without restraint. It was the compulsion to build endlessly, to consume endlessly, to possess endlessly, until even the limits of morality and empire collapsed under its weight. His palaces remain as cold reminders that obsession, when masked as progress, can become its own intoxicant. And as the 20th century dawned, another monarch to the north would carry his own quieter dependency, not born of empire or greed, but of habit and solace, a king whose daily ritual of tobacco became both comfort and symbol of endurance through war and isolation. 27. Håkon II, King of Norway, RT 1905 to 1957. Håkon VII, the first king of independent Norway, is remembered as a symbol of courage, integrity, and quiet endurance. Unlike many monarchs of the modern age, his life was defined by restraint rather than extravagance. Yet behind the carefully composed dignity of his public image lay a quieter dependence, his lifelong addiction to tobacco, particularly snuff, which became both a ritual of solace and a shield against the relentless pressure of duty. Though mild compared to the destructive vices of earlier monarchs, Håkon's habit revealed the human need for small comforts amid great responsibility. Born Prince Carl of Denmark, Håkon was an unlikely king. When Norway voted to dissolve its union with Sweden in 1905, he was chosen to lead the newly independent nation, a symbolic figure meant to embody stability and modern constitutional monarchy. Accepting the role, he took the Norwegian name Håkon and devoted himself to his adopted homeland with humility and discipline. His reign would span 2 world wars, economic depression, and the redefinition of monarchy in a democratic age. But beneath the calm exterior of a wise ruler was a man burdened by solitude, expectation, and constant vigilance. Tobacco offered Håkon a kind of ritual control in a world that allowed little privacy. Each morning he followed a meticulous routine, a walk through the palace gardens, a moment of reflection with his pipe or snuff box, and a quiet breakfast before official audiences. His personal aides noted that he rarely appeared without a small, polished tin of snuff, often a gift from foreign dignitaries, and that he kept several boxes scattered across his desks and tables. For him, tobacco was not a mere indulgence. It was an anchor, a steady rhythm in the unpredictable tides of political life. During the German occupation of Norway, 1940 to 1945, when Håkon fled to Britain and led his government in exile, the habit took on deeper significance. Surrounded by uncertainty and exile's loneliness, he maintained his tobacco ritual with quiet discipline. His staff rationed small supplies of snuff and cigarettes, knowing how much the gesture of a single pinch or puff steadied his nerves. Even in moments of profound decision, such as his refusal to appoint a Nazi-backed government, he was remembered sitting calmly, tobacco in hand, thinking before he spoke. The gesture became symbolic of his endurance, modest, measured, and unshaken. After the war, Håkon returned to a liberated Norway as a national hero. Yet the toll of decades of stress showed on his health. Doctors urged him to limit his tobacco use, but he resisted. "It has been my companion through every storm," he reportedly remarked. His people never saw it as a flaw. Rather, it humanized him, a small imperfection in an otherwise exemplary life. Håkon VII's addiction was one of quiet dependence rather than destruction. It reflected the balance he maintained between human frailty and royal duty. His reign stands as proof that even the most steadfast monarchs find refuge in rituals that tether them to ordinary life. And as Hakon's reign drew to a close, another ruler in the Ottoman lineage, one ruling from seclusion rather than exile, would face his own secret reliance on tobacco and solitude, hiding his weakness behind the silence of the harem walls and the censorship of empire. 28. Abd-al-Hamid II, Ottoman Sultan, 1876 to 1909. Abd al-Hamid II ruled an empire at the crossroads of collapse and renewal. To his supporters, he was the last great Ottoman sovereign, a ruler of vision, intellect, and survival instinct. To his critics, he was a paranoid autocrat clinging to fading glory through censorship and control. Yet behind both images, reformer and despot, lay a weary, deeply human man whose secret dependency on tobacco and stimulants revealed the toll of ruling a realm under siege. His long nights of solitude, punctuated by the scent of smoke, became emblematic of a ruler trapped between the demands of modernity and the ghosts of an empire's past. When Abd al-Hamid ascended the throne in 1876, the Ottoman Empire was in crisis. The treasury was bankrupt, the provinces restless, and the European powers circling like vultures. At first, he appeared the reformer. He promulgated a constitution, promised representative government, and courted modernization. But the pressures of foreign intrigue and internal rebellion soon hardened him. Within 2 years, the constitution was suspended, and the Sultan withdrew into the seclusion of Yildiz Palace, a gilded fortress that became both his sanctuary and his prison. Inside Yildiz, Abd al-Hamid ruled through paper and wire, telegrams, secret police reports, and endless correspondence. His distrust of courtiers and diplomats deepened, and so too did his dependence on small comforts that steadied his nerves. Tobacco was chief among them. Chroniclers and palace attendants noted that the Sultan smoked incessantly. First cigars, later cigarettes rolled with precision by his servants. The palace air, one visitor remarked, carried the faint, constant perfume of tobacco and ink. To him, the act of smoking was both contemplation and defense, a ritual that calmed his racing mind during long nights of solitude. But tobacco was not his only stimulant. Physicians occasionally prescribed mild tonics, coffee extracts, herbal infusions, and mixtures of coca leaves fashionable among European elites of the period to sustain his energy through the endless hours of administration. These medicinal restoratives, as they were discreetly called, offered temporary focus, but exacted a hidden price in agitation and fatigue. His aides observed how the Sultan's hands sometimes trembled after hours at his desk, yet no one dared to question his regimen. In the official records, his health remained excellent, his will undiminished. The secrecy surrounding his habits mirrored his larger rule. Everything at Yildiz was managed through silence and control. Servants forbidden to speak of what they saw, courtiers rotated frequently to prevent intimacy. To the public, the Sultan was a figure of mystery, aloof, all-seeing, and omnipresent through spies and decrees. Few suspected the loneliness that drove his dependence or the fatigue that crept into his once vigorous mind. In his final years, as the Young Turk movement gained momentum and his empire slipped further from his grasp, Abd al-Hamid's isolation deepened. Reports from palace insiders describe the Sultan sitting alone at night by the window, cigarette smoke curling through the lamplight, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon of the Bosporus. Tobacco had become his companion, its rhythm the only constant in a reign defined by uncertainty. When he was deposed in 1909, the man who had ruled an empire of continents left quietly, taking with him a few books, a prayer rug, and his beloved tobacco case. Even in exile, he continued his ritual, the steady smoke linking him to the vanished empire he had tried to preserve. Abd al-Hamid II's addiction was one of endurance rather than excess, a means of surviving isolation within power. His reign, like the curling smoke of his cigarettes, was both ephemeral and enduring, the last wisp of Ottoman grandeur fading into the modern age. And as his empire fell into history, another kingdom, newer, smaller, but equally vulnerable, would face a monarch whose indulgence in drink and decadence would bring his dynasty to its knees, ushering Europe into the last age of royal ruin. 29. Carol II, King of Romania, written 1930 to 1940. Carol II of Romania was a monarch of dazzling contradictions, charismatic yet unstable, cultured yet self-destructive. He began his life as a golden prince, adored by his people and destined to modernize a young European kingdom. But the same hunger for excitement and validation that made him captivating would also become his undoing. Behind the royal ceremonies and patriotic speeches lay an addiction to alcohol, nightlife, and reckless excess, habits that both defined and doomed his turbulent reign. Born in 1893 to Crown Prince Ferdinand and Princess Marie, Carol grew up surrounded by the romantic myth of monarchy, but chafed under its restraints. Intelligent, fluent in several languages, and deeply interested in art, he was also impulsive and rebellious. His youth was marked by scandal, desertion from the army during World War I to pursue a love affair, secret marriages, and defiance of royal protocol. Though each indiscretion was smoothed over by his family, the pattern was set. Carol was a man who treated life like a gamble, assuming fortune would always favor him. When he finally ascended the throne in 1930, Romania was a kingdom divided by political factions and economic troubles. At first, Carol appeared as the modernizer his nation needed. He toured the countryside, revived industry, and cultivated a sophisticated public image. Yet behind the scenes, his court became notorious for its decadence. Late-night parties, banquets, and drinking sessions were routine. Foreign diplomats described the palace as a theatre of indulgence, where ministers were summoned not for counsel but for company. His longtime companion, Magda Lupescu, a woman of striking intelligence and influence, became both his confidant and enabler, her presence blurring the line between private pleasure and public scandal. Alcohol played a central role in Carol's escapism. Wine and brandy flowed freely at his table, easing the strain of leadership but deepening his impulsiveness. Advisors who urged moderation were dismissed or ignored. His judgment grew erratic. Appointments were made on whim, dismissals on anger. While Romania's press was tightly censored to maintain his image, whispers of his indulgence spread through diplomatic circles and foreign newspapers. The monarch who claimed to embody national renewal had instead become a symbol of excess. By the late 1930s, Carol's personal and political worlds were collapsing. The rise of fascism and the growing threat from Nazi Germany demanded clarity and restraint, qualities the king, weary and addicted, could no longer summon. His reliance on alcohol and the emotional cocoon of Lupescu's company left him increasingly detached from reality. When public outrage and political pressure forced his abdication in 1940, he fled the country with her, carrying trunks of jewels, gold, and memories of a squandered kingdom. In exile, Carol's lifestyle hardly changed. He drank, travelled, and reminisced about the grandeur he had lost. Though stripped of power, he continued to live as if still enthroned, unable to abandon the rituals of luxury that had long replaced purpose. When he died in 1953, few mourned him as a king. Most remembered him as a warning, a monarch undone not by his enemies, but by his appetites. Carol II's addiction was more than personal. It was symbolic of Europe's final age of royal decadence, when crowns glittered but foundations crumbled. His life closed at the chapter on Old World monarchy, setting the stage for a century in which rulers would no longer be gods of indulgence, but mere men revealed at last in their frailty. And before history turned its page fully from kings and courts, one final tale remained. A monarch mythologized by his people, a ruler of ancient faith whose story blurred fact and legend, standing at the threshold where myth met monarchy. 30. Alfonso I Henrique, King of Portugal, RT 1139 to 1185. Alfonso I, known to history as Afonso Henriques, was not merely Portugal's first king, but its founding myth, a warrior monarch who carved a nation from the frontier between Christendom and the Islamic world. His story is written in the language of battles, faith, and triumph, yet beneath the heroic legend lies the portrait of a man both restless and human. Chroniclers of later centuries, eager to sanctify his image, erased much of what was personal, but traces remain of his dependence on drink, games of chance, and the exhilaration of risk, habits that, while never officially acknowledged, accompanied the long and lonely process of conquest. Born around 1109, Alfonso grew up in a world of uncertainty. The Iberian Peninsula was a mosaic of warring kingdoms, shifting alliances, and fragile loyalties. As the son of Henry of Burgundy and Countess Teresa of Leon, he inherited not a kingdom but a contested territory, a marchland of castles and ambitions. From his youth, Alfonso's life revolved around battle. He led men at an age when others still learned to read, fought both Moorish armies and Christian rivals, and eventually declared Portugal an independent realm after his victory at Urique in 1139. The people hailed him as king, and the papacy eventually recognized him as such. Yet the ceaseless rhythm of war brought both glory and exhaustion. Chronicles written after his death praise his discipline and piety, but local traditions and later Iberian accounts hint at moments of excess. The long campaigns across the Alentejo and the Tagus Valley were harsh, and wine was both nourishment and medicine for soldiers and commander alike. Alfonso was said to drink heartily after victories, his tent filled with laughter and music. In a world where celebration was brief and survival uncertain, the line between ritual and indulgence blurred easily. As he aged, Alfonso's reliance on wine deepened into habit. Injuries from battle left him in chronic pain, and wine dulled what medicine could not. The court chroniclers, bound to the sanctity of the founding king, avoided mention of dependence, describing instead his festive generosity. But the royal treasurers recorded growing expenditures for imported vintages from Porto and Galicia, evidence that the cup had become more than symbol. Even his fondness for games of chance, dice and chess, was remembered as part of his vigor. But beneath the admiration for his daring lay a quiet truth. For Alfonso, gambling was an extension of the battlefield, a way to relive the thrill of risk in peace. He ruled as he played, with courage, unpredictability, and faith that fortune favored the bold. In his later years, crippled by age and injury, the once tireless warrior spent more time in reflection. His letters to monastic orders reveal a tone of repentance, an awareness that even kings of destiny were not immune to the weaknesses of men. When he died in 1185, Portugal mourned not only its founder, but its most human ruler, a man who had built a kingdom through will and chance, devotion and indulgence. Alfonso I's quiet dependencies remind us that even the architects of nations carried private burdens. His story closes the lineage of royal addictions not in scandal but in humanity, a final echo of the truth that has followed every crown through history, that power may command armies, but it cannot conquer the solitude of the soul.